Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 69, The Masons from Fremantle. Just a warning in this episode that some listeners may find some information distressing. There are details of suicide contained in this episode. There was an article on a suicide of a 16-year-old boy, Henry Mason, and this was quite shocking to me considering the way in which his death occurred and the fact that he was so young. So I was intrigued to find out more about his family and maybe the reasons behind why he decided to go ahead with this awful act. Henry Mason was born in 1882 in Western Australia. His parents were Frederick Mason and Alice Marshall. His father, Frederick, was actually born Frederick May in Middlesex, England in 1843. Frederick was transported on the Merchantman to Fremantle on the 12th of September 1864 under the alias John Mason. He was also known as Frederick Way. He was tried at the Middlesex Sessions in Clerkenwell for receiving stolen goods, and he received a sentence of transportation for 7 years due to previous convictions. His occupation at the time of his conviction was a brass finisher, and he was recorded as literate. He received his ticket of leave on the 26th of May 1866. He married Amelia Wilcox in Fremantle in 1868. Amelia had been previously married to John Garden in 1865 when she was 16, and she had 2 children with him, one who survived infancy. John Garden died in 1867. At this stage, Frederick was using his birth name, Frederick May, no doubt to cover his convict record. His children with Amelia were all registered under the name of May for their births. Frederick received his certificate of freedom on the 20th of March 1873. By 1874 he was living in Fremantle, Western Australia, using the name Frederick Mason. He does have a jail record, and this stated that while he was in Western Australia he worked as a saddler, a labourer, a general servant, a fitter, an apprentice dentist and a jeweller. So he had wide and varied occupations. On the 9th of December 1874, there was an article in the paper, Jewelry, unreserved sale of valuable jewellery at Fremantle. Philip Webster has received instructions from Mr. Frederick Mason, goldsmith, High Street, Fremantle, who is leaving his present premises, to sell by public auction the whole and extensive valuable stock of jewellery, watches and clocks, also fixtures, counters, showcases and other valuable property without the slightest reserve. Less than 2 years later, in September 1876, a death notice, Mason, on the 18th of August 1876 at her residence in Fremantle, Amelia, the wife of Frederick Mason, jeweller, aged 27 years, deeply regretted by her sorrowing family and large circle of friends. Interestingly, Amelia's gravestone information had John Garden listed as her spouse, but 3 of her infant children that she had with Frederick Mason are buried with her, having the surname May. Frederick and Amelia had 5 sons in total, with 2, Charles Henry and Frederick Jr., surviving infancy. Frederick Sr. then commenced a relationship with Alice Marshall around 1879, who had been a servant in their household. Alice was born in Fremantle in 1861, so she would have been 17 and Frederick 37 when their relationship commenced. They had 3 children together between 1880 and 1883, and 2 of those children survived infancy. Frederick sailed to Venice on the 7th of August 1882 and then returned to Western Australia on the 27th of March 1883. He had opened up another jewellery business by the sounds of it, as it was recorded that he sold his jewellery business in Fremantle in 1885. He went to London on the 13th of September 1889 and returned to Western Australia on the 16th of January 1891. He then went to Victoria on the 18th of June 1898 and then returned to Western Australia on the 24th of October 1898. So he was certainly in and out of the country and going from one colony to another. On the 11th of May 1898, Frederick left Alice to marry Bertha Sophie Hilmer, née Bade, in Fremantle. Bertha was born in Castlemaine, Victoria in 1863, and she was 20 years younger than Frederick when they married. Bertha had been married to Robert Hilmer in 1885, and he had died in 1894. She had 2 children with Robert. Bertha had been leasing the Railway Hotel in North Fremantle for 2 to 3 years. This was a hotel that Frederick actually owned prior to their marriage. And then in June 1898, the following distressing scene occurred. The Golden Age, a Coolgardie paper, outlined this on the 16th of June 1898. Dreadful tragedy, a lad of 16 shoots himself. Sad family scandal. In Perth on 15th of June, a terrible tragedy occurred at North Fremantle tonight when a boy named Henry Mason, aged 16, a clerk at the employ of McElrath, McKern and Company, shot himself. The deceased was the son of Mr. Frederick Mason, an old resident of the colony and one of the wealthiest men in Fremantle, owning the greater portion of the main street and a large quantity of other property. For many years, Mason Sr. had been residing in North Fremantle with a woman who was always supposed to be his wife, and by whom he had 5 children, Henry Mason being one of them. Great surprise was caused amongst friends and family, and a painful scandal occasioned when Mason Sr., about a month ago, married a Mrs. Hilmer, who had been renting a hotel from him. It then became known that the woman he had lived with for so long was not his wife at all. The disclosure preyed greatly on the mind of young Mason. Mason Sr., with his newly made wife, intended to go to the eastern colonies by the mail steamer Karlsruhe, and by arrangement met his 2 sons near the North Fremantle railway station soon after 8 p.m. He shook hands with the younger son, but on offering his hand to Henry, the latter drew a revolver and, putting it to his head, fired. Mason Sr. fled immediately and a crowd gathered. For a long time it was thought that the 2 boys had been playing with the revolver and that the affair was accidental. Young Mason was taken home but never recovered consciousness and died about 11 p.m. A paper was found on him bearing the words, "Everybody knows why I committed suicide." The facts then leaked out and the police made an effort to find Mason Sr., but were for some time unsuccessful. An impression then gained ground that he had also done something rash, but at a late hour he was discovered on the German mail steamer with his newly created wife. After some pressure on part of the police, Mason returned to North Fremantle, Mrs. Mason going on in the mail steamer. And there was another small article relating to the event. It says the mother of the lad was considerably upset by the death of her son. In conversation with one of our representatives, she admitted that she'd never been married to Mr. Mason, although she had lived with him as his wife for 18 years. The fact of the illegitimacy of her children had been kept a secret from the latter and was discovered by them only through their father's recent marriage in the registrar's office with Mrs. Hilmer. The lad Henry had taken the matter so greatly to heart, and in the end it had driven him to commit suicide. There was an inquest held into the tragedy, and it says death through disgrace and shame. The news of the extraordinary suicide of the youth Henry Mason at North Fremantle on Wednesday night created a profound sensation at Fremantle yesterday. The details gleaned at a late hour by the West Australian Reporter, sensational and peculiar as they were, have been fully confirmed by the evidence given at the inquest held yesterday at North Fremantle. The inquiry was conducted at the police station North Fremantle by Mr. R. Fairburn, RM, acting as coroner. Frederick Mason stated that he was the father of the deceased, Henry Mason, who was aged between 15 and 17 years. He last saw the deceased alive at 8:30 o'clock on the previous evening at the corner of John and Delisle Streets. The witness was then on his way to the railway station to ascertain what time the next train left for Fremantle. He met his younger son Ernest at the same spot. Ernest said, "Is that you, Dad?" The witness said, "Yes." Ernest said, "Are you going away?" The witness said, "Yes, shake hands, my boy." They shook hands and the witness said, "Who have you got with you?" Ernest made no answer and the witness said, "Why, I think it's Sonny." The witness walked towards him, that is Sonny, and said, "Shake hands, my boy," as he walked towards him, he saw a flash and heard a report and saw the boy, Sonny, fall. The witness thought at first that there was a bit of a joke on the boy's part, but when he saw the boy on the ground, he ran to the doctor, whom the witness knows at the hotel, about a dozen yards distant. He said to the doctor, "My son has shot himself." Mr. Silky was with the witness when the occurrence took place. The witness had not seen the deceased for weeks prior to the occurrence. An examination was made by the doctor, and the witness saw a wound in the boy's forehead. The witness then went away, leaving the deceased with the doctor. The deceased lived on the same premises as the witness, but the latter did not know that any firearm was kept or was in the possession of the deceased. The coroner asked, "Were you married to the deceased's mother?" The witness said no. "How long have you lived with her?" "About 20 years. "How many children did you have?" 3. "You have got married lately?" He said, "Yes, we have had a lot of domestic trouble. I got married a couple of months ago to Mrs. Hilmer, who kept the Railway Hotel." "Were any of your children dissatisfied at what you had done, and did they ever speak to you about it?" "Yes, but not that boy." "How do you know they were not satisfied with your marriage?" There was no answer. Sergeant Houlihan, "Did the children ever speak to you about the marriage?" He said no. "Did the boy ever know that you were not married to his mother?" He said no. "Did the mother ever say anything to you about the marriage? How did she take it?" "Oh yes, she said she could not believe it." "How have the boys treated you since the marriage? Did they complain about being badly treated as regards to the distribution of the property?" "No," he said, "my eldest boys are born in marriage." The jury, was there any reason for the youngest son not to speak to you? "Well, he was loafing around and I told him when he got a suit of clothes made that he'd better earn them first. This occurred a long time before I married Mrs. Hilmer." Sergeant Houlihan asked, "What provision was made for the support of the boys under age while you were away?" He said, "I left £3 a week and a furnished house for them with their mother, and they could have anything more than they wanted. When I saw the deceased in the doctor's hands, I went away. I was so upset." The coroner asked, "You wanted to get away out of the colony, didn't you?" He answered, "Yes. I had already taken my passage for the Eastern Colonies and had my luggage aboard the steamer for Melbourne." Ernest Mason, aged 15, said the deceased was his brother with whom he was in the company of the previous evening. They left their home together about 7:30 p.m. with the purpose of firing stones at Mrs. Hilmer. When they got to the Delisle Street, they saw two ladies walking towards the railway station. The deceased said, "That's Mrs. Hilmer. I can tell her voice." They followed the ladies up to the station and found out that it was not Mrs. Hilmer, and came back and stood at the corner of Delisle and John Streets. This was where Mrs. Hilmer lived, and they waited there. Both the deceased and the witness picked up stones. The deceased said, "When father comes out, you call him away and I will fire at Mrs. Hilmer." When the father came out of the Railway Hotel about a quarter of an hour afterwards, Mr. Silky was with him. The witness said when he saw that Mrs. Hilmer was not with them, "I'm not going up," meaning that Mrs. Hilmer was not there. No further waiting was required. The deceased said, "Oh, you better go up to him and say goodbye to him." The witness then went up to Mason and said, "Are you going away, Dad?" Mason said, "Yes, goodbye, my boy," and asked the witness who was with him. Deceased was standing by, and the witness did not answer the query, thinking that his brother did not want Mason to know that he was there. Mason put his hand out to the deceased to shake hands after saying, "I think it's Sonny." Just then there was a flash and a report of a revolver. The witness's brother fell, and the father stepped back and looked at him and ran, saying that he was going for a doctor. The witness knew when leaving home that the deceased possessed a revolver, but did not know that he had it with him at the time. The witness asked the deceased where the revolver was about 10 minutes before they left home, and the deceased said, "It is in my cupboard." The deceased must have had the revolver in his pocket at the time because he did not go to the cupboard for it before they left the house. As they were sitting by the fire before going out, the deceased said that his life was disgraced and no longer worth living. The witness said, "Mrs. Hilmer wants shooting for what she has done." The deceased replied, "Yes, I've got a revolver inside." The deceased also said, "I won't shoot Mrs. Hilmer because I would be a murderer, and it would be a greater disgrace to the family. If I shot her, I would shoot myself afterwards." The coroner asked, "What effect did your father's marriage with Mrs. Hilmer have on you all?" The witness said, "We all felt pretty bad about it." "You did not know that your father was not married to your mother?" "No, none of us." Sergeant Houlihan asked, "When did you know that your mother was not married to your father?" and he answered, when he got married to Mrs. Hilmer. The coroner asked, what effect did this have on your brother? He was always talking about it. He cried over it at night after the marriage took place. He said he could not be any lower than he was and that his life was disgraced. A juryman asked, how was it that all of the blame was attached to Mrs. Hilmer? And the witness said, the deceased stated that Dad was not sober at the time that the marriage was fixed up. Dr. Remy gave evidence that on examination of the deceased, whom he found lying on the ground outside the Railway Hotel, he observed that the bullet had penetrated the brain, entering at the right ear and coming out just over the left eye. After being taken to his home, the deceased died at 10:15 p.m, the cause of death being, in witnesses' opinion, laceration of the brain. John Henry Silky gave evidence similar to that of the first witness. Corporal Doherty stated that about 8:30 p.m. he was summoned to the corner of John and Delisle Streets and there saw the deceased lying on the ground, with the doctor leaning over him. The deceased had a large wound over the left eye. The witness found a 5-chambered revolver close to the right-hand side of the deceased. There were 4 chambers leaded and one apparently recently discharged. Police Constable Levy deposed to having found on the body of the deceased the pieces of paper produced, upon which were written the words, "Everyone knows why I have committed suicide." There were also several stones in the right-hand pocket of the coat worn by the deceased. The jury, after a short retirement, returned the following verdict: that the deceased Henry Mason came to his death by suicide, which act was brought about by the disgrace and shame which he felt at being thrust upon him, and we believe at the moment deceased was not responsible for his actions. Information was gleaned on Frederick Sr. from all of the press from his son's suicide, and on the 16th of June 1898, an article in the paper stated, "The Mason's History. No one is better known in the Fremantle district than Frederick Mason, the natural father of the deceased. He was popularly called Old Fred Mason. The possessor of a vast amount of landed property at North Fremantle and Fremantle, and the reputed owner of the greater part of High Street, Mason is certainly one of the wealthiest men in the Fremantle district, if not in the colony. He had resided in the neighbourhood for a great number of years, and for 20 years lived at North Fremantle." So Frederick, after the inquest, immediately moved to Victoria with Bertha, and they resided in Williamstown. Then Frederick is recorded as being in North Fremantle in September 1899, and he made 3 trips to the eastern colonies in 1900. So he certainly moved back and forth between the colonies at that time. The fact that he moved back and forth so often may have put the marriage on rocky ground, as Bertha was recorded as living in Coolgardie in 1903, her occupation being a publican, without Frederick listed. And on the 7th of May 1904, a North Fremantle marriage, Frederick Mason's matrimonial venture, application for divorce. In Melbourne, the story of Frederick Mason's marriage was told by him to Mr. Justice A. Beckett in the divorce court today. The petitioner is 60 years of age and his wife, Bertha Sophie May, is 40 years old. The marriage, the petitioner said, took place on the 11th of May 1898 in the Registrar's office at Fremantle, where the petitioner was a property owner and the respondent a tenant of a hotel owned by him. They came to Melbourne in the following month by different steamers and did not live together until after their arrival here. After stopping 10 days at Williamstown, the petitioner returned to Western Australia on business, and he again returned in the August. After 3 more days of wedded life, the respondent left him. "Why did you marry her?" he was asked. "Did she make you do so?" asked Mr. Wolfe, who appeared for the petitioner. "Well, no, she coaxed me a little bit," replied the petitioner. "You did not live with her in Western Australia?" He said no. "Why not? Was there any reason?" "Well, yes, we wanted to keep it a secret. We were going to travel." "Who came to Victoria first?" He responded, "She did." "Before you came over, did you settle property on her?" "Yes, the big hotel in North Fremantle. I was offered £5,000 for it." "And she got it?" "Yes, she has." "Before you left, did you have a quarrel?" "Yes. She said that she never intended to live with me, but she simply married me for what she could get out of me, and that was when she had got it, I could go." "That was a rather disagreeable shock to you?" "Yes, it was indeed." "Did you reason with her?" "I did." "What happened?" "I went out, and when I came back she was gone." "You gave her money when you were together?" "Yes, whatever she wanted. £100, £20, £10, £5, just as she wanted it." Did you try to find her? Yes, I was back and forward to Western Australia 22 times looking for her. She dodged me every time. When I went one way, she went the other. I went 16 times in the Anglian alone. Did you see her? Yes, and 3 or 4 months after our marriage, she told me she did not want to have anything further to do with me. Did you go to see her again? Yes, but I could not see her. And it is since then that you have made 22 visits to Western Australia. He responded, about 20 of them. When did you see her last? I have not seen her for 5 years. How did you find she was at Mount Morgan's? I met a man in Collins Street and he told me that he saw the name Hilma, her name before our marriage, over a hotel door. And to his astonishment, he found that the hotel was kept by my wife. Why did you wait so long? I thought that she would give way eventually. You thought that she would relent? Yes. You did nothing to justify her in abandoning you? No, nothing in the world. Evidence was given by the petitioner's son to the effect that he had served the petition and the citation on the respondent at her hotel at Mount Morgan's, Western Australia. She only asked if there was anything to sign. A decree nisi was granted on the grounds of desertion. So it sounds like Frederick was taken advantage of by Bertha, and it seems she was only in it for the money. Bertha went on to marry Herman Pernbaum at St James's Church in Sydney in June 1908. Herman was a bachelor and Bertha stated she was a widower. When Alice died in September 1921 in Fremantle, she went by the surname Mason, and it mentions Frederick, her stepson, attending the funeral alongside her children with Frederick, Ernest and Alice. The obituary in the Daily News in Perth. The late Mrs. Alice Mason. The funeral of the late Mrs. Alice Mason, relict of the late Mr. Frederick Mason of Swan Street, North Fremantle, took place on Monday afternoon and was attended by many friends. The deceased, who was 60, was born at Fremantle and been a resident of this state all her life. 1 son and 1 daughter survive her. The funeral cortege moved from her late residence and proceeded to Karrakatta Cemetery, where the remains were laid to rest in the congregational portion. And as mentioned, 2 of the chief mourners were Mr. Ernest Mason, her son, and Mr. Fred Mason, her stepson. It says wreaths were placed on the grave by the employees of the Westralian Farmers Limited, relatives and many friends. Frederick was listed in the 1910 census as living at his home in Swan Street, North Fremantle, and his occupation being a gentleman. In 1912 and 1913, he was living with his son Ernest in his Swan Street home. And in 1916 and 1917, Frederick is living at Swan Street with his 2 children, Alice and Ernest. Frederick died at North Fremantle under the name Frederick Mason in 1921. It stated his age was 94, which would have made his birth date 1827. However, in his divorce records in Victoria, he said that he was born in 1843. So Frederick and Amelia Mason's children. Amelia's daughter, Mary Garden, was only a year old when Frederick and Amelia married in 1868. There is a Mary Garden listed in the West Australia census, recorded as a dressmaker, so the assumption is that she never married. Their second child, Charles Bonwell May, was born in 1869 and died in 1870 in Fremantle. The third child, Charles Henry May, was born in 1871 in Fremantle and died on the 20th of July 1904 as Charles Henry Mason. And there was a short death notice. Mason, on July 20th at Topham, Dr. Haynes's private hospital, Charles Henry, the eldest son of Frederick, and the late Amelia Mason, aged 32 years and 6 months. The funeral of Mr. Charles H. Mason took place on Thursday and was largely attended. The deceased was the son of a very old colonist and was an early settler in the Claremont district, where he became widely known and highly respected. He took a prominent part in the West Australia Poultry and Dog Association and other societies. His remains were interred in the congregational part of the Karrakatta Cemetery. The chief mourners were Mr. and Mrs. Frederick Mason, brother and sister-in-law of the deceased, Mr. Ernest Mason, brother. The fourth child, Frederick May, was born in 1872 in Fremantle. And in July 1891, an article referring to him, yesterday afternoon a somewhat serious accident occurred at Fremantle. While Mr. Fred Mason Jr. was engaged in working on the deck of the barque Thorley Bank, lying at Owen's acreage, he accidentally fell down the hold a distance of 22 foot. He was picked up and speedily conveyed to his father's residence at North Fremantle. Dr. White was sent for and found the injuries consisted of spraining of both wrists, cuts on the face and considerable bruising around the body. We understand that Mr. Mason is now progressing satisfactorily towards recovery from his injuries. He married Dora McLaughlin as Frederick May in Fremantle in 1894. Frederick was a gardener and he owned an orchard in Claremont in 1911. Frederick and Dora had 5 children. In 1940, Fred had over 1,000 acres of land and sold it. He died on the 29th of June 1961 at Claremont, Western Australia, aged 88, and he's buried with his brother Charles Henry. The 5th child of Frederick and Amelia was James Bromwell May, born 1874 and died on the 28th of August 1874 in Fremantle. And the 6th child, Frank May, born 1875, and he died on the 5th of January 1876 in Fremantle. Frederick Mason and Alice Marshall's children. The firstborn was Alice May. She was born in 1880. She married Frederick James Wand in 1899 in Fremantle when she was 19. Frederick was a clerk on the railways. They had 2 daughters and 1 Velda survived infancy. Frederick died in 1936 and he was listed as a storekeeper and they were living at Dangan. And Alice died in 1957 at Subiaco, Western Australia, aged 77. The second child, Henry Albert Mason, known as Sonny, born 1882 and died on the 15th of June 1898. And it mentions in another article the lad Henry Mason was a highly respectable young fellow. The third child, Ernest Edwin Mason, was born in 1883. He was living in the family home in 1912 at North Fremantle and also in 1925 to 1931. His occupation was listed as a plate layer. I was unable to find any further information on Ernest Edwin Mason. So Frederick was the only child that survived from the union of Frederick and Amelia. So out of the 9 children that Frederick Mason had, only 3 of them survived into adulthood.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.